Welcome to HSC Alliance MasterClass Series. Today's masterclass has the title Beyond Halal Compliance, Building Sustainable and ESG-driven Halal Supply Chains. Today's masterclass is conducted by Dr. Mohamed Syazwan Ab Talib. Dr. Syazwan is an assistant professor of logistics management at the Universiti Brunei Darussalam. His research and teaching focuses primarily on logistics and supply chain management, with the focus on halal principles, halal standard, Sharia compliant distribution and supply chain performance. He actively writes and publishes academic papers and presents at international conferences. These are also locations where we often meet. Dr. Syazwan holds a PhD in management from University Technology Malaysia and an MBA in logistics management from Universiti Selangor, amongst others. Dr. Syazwan, how are you doing today?
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much, Professor Michael, for having me.
It's a great privilege having you. We have been in contact on the topic of halal supply chain management for many years, and often frequently meeting each other at academic conferences. The floor is yours, so please start with your presentation.
Assalamualaikum, very good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining this online masterclass organized by the HSC Alliance. So today, I will be speaking about a topic that is becoming increasingly important for both industry and academia, which is moving beyond halal compliance and looking at halal supply chain from a broader sustainability and governance perspective. So the title that I bring forward for this session is Beyond Halal Compliance, Building Sustainable and ESG-driven Halal Supply Chain. So over the past decade, the halal industry has grown rapidly across sectors such as food, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and even tourism. And as this industry expands and becomes more and more connected with the global market, of course, expectations are also evolving. So consumers, businesses, governments, so stakeholders in general, they are asking new questions. They are asking, is halal supply chain management only about certification and compliance? Okay, or is it also address environmental responsibility, social accountability, and in terms of governance? So in this session, inshallah, we will explore how halal supply chain can evolve in that direction. Okay, so my goal today is to provide a clear and hopefully practical perspective on how halal principles can align with ESG thinking and why this alignment is becoming important for the future of the halal economy. Okay, so before we move on to the main discussion, let me briefly outline what we will be covering in this session. Okay, so first we will begin with why this topic matters today, and then we will briefly revisit what a halal supply chain is, and then we will continue discussion where we're going to look at where the traditional compliance models fall short, because while compliance is essential to preserve halal integrity, it does not always address the sustainability issues such as environmental impact or labor practices and governance transparency. Okay, and then after that, I will introduce a conceptual framework called the Halal Supply Chain Governance Pyramid, and then we will try to link it with an operational case study, particularly in the area of halal food packaging. And then finally, we will look at the strategic application for businesses and perhaps regulators and the industry stakeholders in general. So with that in mind, let us begin by looking at why this topic has become increasingly important today. So, like I've mentioned earlier, the global halal economy has expanded significantly. So what was once largely associated with food product has now moved far beyond that. So today, halal is no longer a niche market. In fact, it has become part of a global trade and global value chain. Okay, and at the same time, another major development is also happening concurrently in the global business sector, which is the ESG, okay, the environmental, social, and governance framework, where it has become the mainstream. So governments, investors, multinational corporations are increasingly using ESG criteria to evaluate business performance. Okay, so in other words, companies nowadays, they are being evaluated not only on profitability alone, but also on how responsibly they operate their business. So this, of course, has caused a rising expectation. Okay? So investors, regulators, and consumers are demanding more than just certification. Okay? They are asking deeper questions about how products are being produced and how are they being delivered. So for halal supply chain, this creates an important question. Okay, so the question could be, say, is halal certification alone enough to meet the growing expectation, or should, say, halal supply chain also demonstrate environmental responsibility? Should it also look at social fairness and transparent governance? So in other words, is halal compliance sufficient for the realities of 2026 and beyond? So this question is what motivates the topic and today's discussion. Okay, so to answer the question properly, I think it would be beneficial for us to understand what exactly we mean when we say halal supply chain. Okay, so in simple terms, a halal supply chain ensures that the halal integrity is preserved from the source all the way to the final consumer. So this means that halal assurance is not only limited to the product itself, it also includes, excuse me, it also includes everything that happens before the product even enters the market, or even before the product reaches the consumer. So this includes things like sourcing and procuring of ingredients, processing, materials, logistics, storage, distribution, retail, everything. So you can see over here, these are the 4 core elements that typically define a halal supply chain. So the halal ingredients, segregation, dedicated facilities, and certification and audits. So when it comes to halal ingredients, all inputs used in the product must be verified as permissible according to the Sharia law, according to the Islamic law. So this verification often begins at the origin, such as farms, slaughterhouses, or even the very first supplier. And then when it comes to segregation, halal products must be clearly separated from non-halal or non-certified items during transportation, during storage. And so this separation helps prevent potential cross-contamination and protects the integrity of the halal products. And then talking about segregation, the element of dedicated facility will come in. Okay, so in certain industry, especially food processing sector, facilities or equipment may need to be dedicated exclusively for halal production to avoid cross-contamination. So if you think about, it's Ramadan, so hotel kitchens. So They may maintain separate preparation areas using separate utensils and cooking equipment for halal food only. So this ensures that halal dishes are not prepared using the same surface or the tools that may have come in contact with non-halal ingredients. So, and then if you look at supermarkets or retail outlets, okay, so halal certified products will maybe stored in separate display sections or has its own dedicated shelves, and sometimes even handled using separate storage and refrigeration areas. So this separation helps to maintain the integrity of halal products throughout the retail stage. And of course, when it comes to halal supply chain, you cannot escape to talk about certification and audits. So halal certification bodies like JAKIM in Malaysia, MUIS in Singapore, and the Department of Halal Food Control here in Brunei, these certification bodies verify that companies comply with halal standards. So they process. So the process usually involves very strict, very stringent documentation reviews, inspections, and of course the periodic audits. So taking all this into context, they form the governance structure that protects halal integrity across the supply chain. And so far, this system has been very effective. It has been very effective in building consumer trust, in building legitimacy in the halal market. But while this compliance system is necessary, it has limitations. Okay, so to understand the limitation, we need to look at how halal governance has traditionally been struck by looking at the compliance model. Okay, so in most countries, halal supply chain operates under what we call the compliance governance model. So organizations like JAKIM, for example, they are the gatekeeper. They are the certification body acting as the gatekeeper that evaluate whether a company meets halal standards before allowing them to use the halal logo and to allow it to be sold to the general market. And then there are, of course, the periodic audits and inspections. So company must demonstrate that their processes continue to comply with the halal requirements, and then the halal practices are maintained consistently over time, both for domestic production and maybe for export. And then when it comes to regulatory enforcement mechanism, in many countries like Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and also Singapore, halal certification is supported by government agency or recognized authorities that oversees halal standards and compliance. So these authorities help to ensure that the certification coming in are credible, they are standardized, and of course legally recognized. Okay, and they also provide regulatory oversight, meaning companies that misuse halal claim will face penalties and enforcement actions. And then the system, the compliance system currently heavily relies on documentation for traceability records. So companies are expected to maintain very detailed records of where did they source their materials from, what are the processes involved, and who handles the activities, so that all the compliance can be verified. Okay? And now, this compliant models, of course, has its strength. It plays a critical role in protecting religious legitimacy and building consumer trust. Okay, because without certification and the oversight, we, the consumer, it would be very difficult for us to verify whether a product really meets halal requirements or not. But then again, the system also has a limitation, because it tends to have a very narrow scope, or it's too focused primarily on checking whether rules are being followed rather than looking at the broader impact of the supply chain operations. So in other words, the system is largely reactive and compliance driven rather than strategic or forward looking. And this approach contradicts the findings in one of my research published back in 2018, whereby on one hand, businesses, they are proactive. They are proactive when it comes to meeting halal standards and fulfilling all the requirements. But unfortunately, the governance, the regulatory side of the business seems to be a little bit reactive, and they're playing catch up. Okay. And because of this narrow scope and reactive measures, certain important issues can remain outside of the conversation. Okay, so the next question we should ask is, where exactly does the current compliance model fall short? Okay? Because while halal certification is essential to protect halal integrity, it does not automatically address issues that are becoming increasingly important in the current modern supply chain. Okay, so issues like environmental footprints of supply chain and issues relating to labor and ethical practices, as well as fragmented halal standards across countries that signifies the or relates to weak cross-border harmonization. Okay, so the key point here is that compliance protects halal integrity, no doubt, but it does not automatically ensure that sustainability, it does not automatically ensure ethical responsibility or governance across the global supply chain. And this is exactly where the ESG thinking begins to enter the conversation. Okay, so as you know, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's basically a framework used to evaluate how organizations, how they manage their responsibilities beyond financial performance. Okay, so for example, environmental refers to how companies manage their impact on the natural environment, and social therefore relates to how organizations treat people and the surrounding communities across their entire operations. And then the governance here refers to how organizations are managed and how they are held accountable. Okay, now ESG has become increasingly important because it's no longer just a voluntary concept. Okay, it has influence on investment decisions, market access, and corporate reporting requirement across many industries in many countries. So, for example, many logistic companies are now evaluated by investors based on their ability or their carbon reduction strategies. So firms like DHL or Maersk Liner, they are committed to large-scale decarbonization initiatives, as well as investment in electric delivery fleets, using sustainable aviation fuel, and of course, results to low carbon shipping. So these initiatives are closely monitored by investors who increasingly favors companies with clear sustainability strategies. So ESG nowadays has become part of the operating rules of global trade, especially for industries like transportation and logistics that play a central role in the global supply chain. So this raises an interesting question for the halal industry, because we all know halal supply chains already emphasize on on ethics and on responsible conduct. But how does ESG relate to the Islamic principles. Okay? So, but an even more important question one should ask is ESG something external to the halal system, or is it actually consistent with the Islamic principles? Because when we look closely and when we look at the literature, we find that many ESG ideas are already embedded within the Islamic teaching. For example, the concept of Khalifa, which refers to the stewardship of the earth. So in Islam, humans are considered caretakers of the environment. We are entrusted with the responsibility to manage natural resources responsibly. So from an ESG's perspective, this aligns directly with the environmental responsibility. It encourages businesses to reduce waste, manage their resources carefully, and then try to minimize environmental harm across their operation. And then we also have the concept of adil, which means justice, justice in labor, practice, and trade. So this emphasis on the fairness in economic activities, including fair trade of the employees, fair trade of practices in general, and of course, equitable distribution of benefits. So now, in modern business language, this connects strongly with the social dimensions of ESG, particularly labor rights and ethical sourcing. And then we have another concept, which is the amana, which means trust and accountability and transparent governance. So in Islamic context, organizations in principle are expected to act with honesty, with transparency, and of course, responsibility. So these align closely with the governance pillar of the ESG, which emphasizes on transparency, accountability, and the ethical oversight. And then, of course, lastly, we have the concept of Maqasid al-Sharia, which refers to the broader objective of Islamic law, whereby it includes the protection of life, the protection of wealth and dignity, and the overall societal well-being. So when you view through this lens, sustainability and responsible governance are fully consistent with Islamic principles. So the key point here is this: ESG is not external to halal. It's not separate from the halal principles. But in many ways, ESG can be seen as an operational extension of values that are already existing within the Islamic teaching. And this perspective helps us to move beyond the ideas that halal is only about certification. So, but rather, halal supply chain should be viewed as a system of ethical and responsible economic activity. Okay? But then again, when these principles are translated into real life logistic and supply chain operation, we can begin to see some challenges, whether it's feasible or not. Okay, so because of course halal supply chain is designed to protect halal integrity, but some operational practices are unintentionally created. Okay, and this has caused environmental inefficiencies. Okay? So, for instance, a vehicle delivering halal products may return empty, an empty backhaul, instead of carrying other cargo on the return ship. Okay? So from an environmental perspective, this means additional fuel consumption and unnecessary carbon emission. If you look at an issue like cold chain logistics, so many halal products, particularly meat and processed food, require refrigerated transportation and storage. So of course, cold chain system consume large amounts of electricity and energy. So maintaining halal segregation within the cold storage facility can sometimes increase energy intensity, especially if dedicated storage areas are required. And then you have issues that are related to packaging and segregation practices. So strict separations requires companies to use additional layers of packaging to prevent cross-contamination. And understandably, this will protect halal integrity. But in doing so, this may also generate more packaging waste, especially when plastic materials are being used. So what we can see over here are operational tension. Okay, so because the system designed to protect halal, so the system designed to protect halal integrity can sometimes increase environmental pressure if they are not managed carefully. So this is precisely why integrating ESG thinking into halal supply chain becomes more and more important, because ESG encourages companies to ask broader questions like, how can we protect halal integrity while also reducing environmental impact and at the same time improving operational efficiency? Okay, so beyond the environmental concern, okay, there is also the issue of social pressure and social responsibility across the supply chain. Okay, because as global supply chain becomes more and more transparent, stakeholders are increasingly asking how businesses treat people across their value chain, across their entire operation. So this includes workers, suppliers, farmers, and even the surrounding communities that are affected by the logistics supply chain activities. So this goes beyond halal logo and certification. So the issues such as fair wages, ethical sourcing, the employee welfare, and community inclusions are important issues, but are often overshadowed by the legitimacy concern. Okay, so if you look at ethical sourcing, for example, companies are expected to ensure that the raw materials and inputs that they purchase and put into the process are obtained through responsible and transparent practices. So firms may need to verify how many number of suppliers that they have to engage or to see whether these suppliers engage in exploitative labor or not, okay, and whether their activities are harming the environment. Okay? And when we talk about employees' welfare in the current global supply chain, particularly involving migrant labor, workers' welfare has become an increasingly sensitive issue. Okay, so issues like providing safe working conditions, providing them with appropriate and adequate PPEs, reasonable working hours, and even the general humane treatment of workers across production logistics system are being scrutinized. Okay, so the key point here is that compliance alone does not automatically ensure social justice. Okay, so halal certification ensures that product meet religious requirement, but it does not automatically or always systematically address the social concern. So this is why proactive governance framework are increasingly needed. And beyond the environmental and the social issue, the issue of governance fragmentation. Okay, so this challenge relates to how halal governance operate across different countries and different regulatory system. Okay, and this all happens because of the multiple halal certification body across different countries out there. Okay, so we have to respect, and we know that each country have their own halal authority, their own halal standards, and their own procedures. Okay, while this system work very well within their respective jurisdiction, they can create complexities for companies operating across international markets. And with the many markets and jurisdiction, this leads to the lack of mutual recognition, between certification system, which then results in conflicting or inconsistent standards. And because of no mutual recognition and the conflicting standards, the situation increases both the administrative workload and the operational cost for doing business. So different countries or different companies coming from various countries may interpret halal requirements slightly differently. So this variation may relate to slaughterhouses or slaughter procedures, ingredient verification, how they handle logistics, and of course the certification documentation required. So as a result, companies that export halal products often need to adjust their processes depending on the market that they serve, thereby increasing the compliance costs. Okay, so businesses then they need to obtain multiple certification, they need to do additional audits, and they need to manage different regulatory expectation across various markets. For big corporation, sure, they may still face this issue, but not as significantly as for SMEs. Because for SMEs, this cost can become a significant barrier for them to enter international halal market, let alone establish a halal business in their domestic market. So when we take a step back and look at the global halal economy, one of the most pressing governance challenge is how to harmonize halal standards across border. Okay, because without strong coordination and mutual recognition, the system can become fragmented and it can become inefficient. And this brings us to an important first half conclusion of the first part of the masterclass. So I'd like to quote: halal compliance is necessary. It is necessary for protecting the halal integrity, but increasingly, when we see that compliance alone may no longer be sufficient for the future of the global halal supply chain. So companies today, they are increasingly expected to demonstrate not only halal integrity, but also on environmental responsibility, social accountability, and of course, governance. Okay, so now we come to the central framework of this masterclass, which I refer to as the halal supply chain governance pyramid. So this framework helps us understand how the halal supply chain can evolve over time, or how they should evolve over time. So instead of viewing halal governance as a single layer of certification, we can think of it as a progression of governance maturity. So this governance pyramid, inshallah, will be published soon in one of the chapters of a book that I'm co-editing with Professor Noraida from University of Kuala Lumpur and Associate Professor Kamal Makmur from the University of Bradford. So at the base of the pyramid, we have what we call the foundational compliance. So this level represents the traditional halal system that we discussed earlier. So it focuses on certification, it focuses on audits, regulation, and documentation requirements. So this foundation is extremely important because it establishes religious legitimacy and consumer trust. Because without this foundation, the halal system itself will collapse and will not function. And as halal supply chain become more global and more complex, organization may then begin to move into the second level of the pyramid, which is the halal and ESG convergence. So at this stage, halal governance begins to integrate broader sustainability principles. So here, halal is no longer be treated as an isolated certification system, but instead it becomes part of a broader responsible supply chain strategy. And then finally, at the top, we have what we can describe as this transformative global benchmark. At this stage, halal supply chains are positioned as models of ethical, of sustainable, and of transparent global trade. So in other words, the halal governance does not only ensure that products are permissible, it also demonstrates high standards of sustainability, social responsibility, and governance or excellence in governance. So the pyramid here shows us a clear evolution from compliance to convergence to transformation. Okay, so let's begin by looking closely at every layer of the governance pyramid, starting with the foundational governance, or as we can also call the compliance-based governance. So at this stage, the main objective is, of course, to ensure that halal integrity is preserved. It's preserved throughout the entire supply chain. And to achieve this, the system relies on 4 pillars: certification, audits, regulatory oversight, and religious legitimacy. So we have talked about this in great lengths earlier. And in fact, many, if not all, of halal certified companies out there, be it restaurants, hotels, or service provider, they are all at this level. Okay, so here, certification body would verify that these companies comply with the required halal standards, and then they will do the audits and inspections are conducted periodically, and then they will also monitor halal compliance and ensure that the halal claims are credible and are properly enforced. And then, of course, you get the halal certification or the halal logo that carries not only business legitimacy, but also religious significance, providing a form of assurance to consumers or Muslim consumers that the products comply with the Islamic principles. But it is also important to recognize the limitation of this level. Okay? So the compliance-based governance tends to represent the minimum threshold required to participate in the market or to establish a business in the market. So it ensures that the rules are being followed, but it does not necessarily encourage companies to look at a broader environmental, social, and governance impact. So in other words, it is necessary, but it is inherently static. And so moving forward, this is why firms nowadays should slowly move beyond the first level and going into the second level. Okay? So at this level, of course, firms still maintains the foundational halal compliance system. However, they begin to expand their perspective, not only just on compliance alone. Okay, so instead of asking, is this approach halal, organization or businesses should also ask questions like, how environmentally responsible are our operations? Or questions like, are our suppliers being treated fairly? And say, how transparent and how accountable are our governance system? Okay, so at this stage, we will see how ESG integration appears in practice. Okay, so in terms of the environmental responsibility, so in halal supply chain, this may involve from measuring carbon emissions in halal logistic networks, improving transportation efficiency, or adopting a circular packaging design, for example, to reduce waste. Okay, and then you have the social dimension, and then of course the governance dimension. Okay, so what is important about this stage is that halal compliance and ESG are no longer treated as separate systems, okay, but instead they begin to function as a unified governance network that protects halal integrity while also addressing sustainability and ethical concern. Okay, so this integration represent a significant step forward. Okay, but the evolution does not stop here. Okay, there is still the third level of the pyramid, which represent the most advanced stage of halal supply chain governance. Okay, so moving beyond sector-specific certification into a more global benchmark for ethical trade and responsible supply chain. Or in other words, halal is no longer viewed only as a religious compliance requirement. Instead, it becomes part of a broader framework for responsible business practices. And at this stage, I would say big multinational corporations such as Nestle is at this stage. Not because halal principle is at the core of their business, but because they serve various markets, including Muslim majority markets like Malaysia and Indonesia, as well as in Muslim minority markets like the UK, for example. Okay, so at this stage, firms are conforming to various halal standards, depending on which market they are in or they are serving. So the halal industry needs to have a stronger alignment between halal certification system across various countries. So, and at this level, firms will also have mutual recognition. So this means that halal certification granted in one country can be recognized by other countries. So when mutual recognition agreement exists, company, therefore, they do not need to repeat certification processes when exporting to new markets. So this will reduce duplications, it could potentially lower cost, and of course improve overall efficiency. And aside from meeting international standards and have mutual cross-border recognition, at this stage, firms are aligning with global sustainability framework, including that of the UN SDGs. And they may also begin incorporating halal governance elements into their sustainability reporting framework. They are able to demonstrate how halal practices support responsible and ethical business conduct. So when these four elements come together, the halal supply chain can position themselves as systems of trusted, transparent, and sustainable global trade. So let's look at a practical operation example which involves recycled food packaging. Okay, so packaging is, of course, a critical component of food supply chain because number one, it protects product during storage, during transportation, and for the sake of marketing and consumer convenience. And at the same time, and unfortunately, packaging has become a major issue for many, many years in sustainability discussion, particularly because of the environmental impact of plastic waste. Now, if you look at the diagram here, it illustrates a possible transition within the halal food industry, because currently much of the global halal industry relies on virgin plastic food packaging. Okay, after all, this is a conventional approach. Virgin plastic is widely used because it meets food safety requirements. It's generally accepted within the existing halal standards, and it's a cheaper option. Okay, however, because of sustainability pressure, uh, pushing industries to reduce the dependence on virgin plastic and move towards recyclable packaging material, this is where a challenge arises. Okay, so halal regulatory framework, it states that materials used for direct food contact must meet strict requirements in order to prevent contamination and to maintain purity. So because of this concern, the use of recycled materials in direct contact food packaging becomes restricted. Okay, so the diagram over here illustrates a possible product extension pathway. So instead of immediately replacing the entire system with recyclable food packaging, the industry can gradually develop halal recycled food packaging as an extension of the existing halal packaging solution. And this is doable because, for example, in Indonesia, the Unilever's Bongo, I think it's a soy sauce brand, they have successfully introduced bottle made from 100% recycled plastic while maintaining halal certification. So they are able to showcase that, hey, sustainability initiatives can be integrated with halal product system and regulations and requirement. And when you look at this from an ESG lens, the connections will make sense. I mean, like, you have the environmental perspective, whereby you reduce reliance on virgin plastics that can lower resource extraction, decrease emissions, and reduce packaging waste entirely. And from a social perspective, one could have better waste management, and of course, responsible packaging practices that can benefit the communities and the ecosystem. Okay, and of course, the governance perspective, because introducing recycled materials require strong traceability system to verify the origin, the handling component, and of the overall safety of material use in the halal packaging. So this example shows that halal supply chain sometimes face operational tensions, no doubt, between compliance requirement and sustainability objective. But with proper governance, innovation, in this case of Unilever's Bongon, and technology, this tension could potentially become an opportunity for improvement. And speaking about technology, let's move to digital governance as an enabler. So technologies such as blockchain, IoT monitoring system, digital passport, or digital certification platform are beginning to play an important role. So these technology help to improve traceability. They will help to improve supply chain transparency and provide clearer, unadulterated verification across supply chain. So therefore, a lot of research out there, including those concerning halal food supply chain, has agreed upon that digital tools are becoming an important enabler for more transparent, for more accountable, and globally connected halal supply chain. So the overall goal here is quite simple. Technology helps reduce the risk of fraud. It will improve transparency among supply chain, boost the trust, and support better governance across the halal ecosystem. And increasingly, this digital system can also support ESG reporting, okay? Because they generate enormous amount of reliable data about how supply chain operate. Now, we've looked at the opportunities created by ESG integration, and then we also look at how technology can come into the picture. We should also consider the strategic risk of remaining compliance focused. Okay, so what happens if firms remain focused only on compliance without integrating broader ESG integration? Okay, so issues like they face trade barriers, they could potentially have an impact on investment access. Okay, it could also have a reputational risk because nowadays with social media and rapid information sharing, companies are under constant public scrutiny. Okay, so issues such as labor practices, environmental impact, or social or supply chain transparency can quickly attract attention from media, from NGOs, from consumers, as well as from government authorities. And of course, it has implication on consumer behavior, particularly among younger generations, because research has shown that many consumers nowadays are increasingly value-driven. They want to know not only whether the product is certified, but also they want to know how responsibly it was produced. Okay, so the key message here is quite straightforward. Compliance alone is defensive. It helps firms meet minimum requirement and that's it. But ESG integration is strategic because it allows firms to position themselves for the long-term competitiveness, okay, in the currently globalized, very saturated halal marketplace. Okay, so we look at the risk of staying stagnant, being at the compliance level. Now let's look at the opportunities that emerge when firms integrate ESG into their halal supply chain. Okay, so from basic compliance and incorporating environmental, social, and governance consideration, firms that demonstrate sustainability and governance practices can become more attractive to ESG cautious investors. And at the same time, the integration can open doors to green and sustainability linked financial instruments like green sukuk or sustainability linked loans, for example. Okay, and another important benefit is, of course, the ability to reach a broader consumer market. Because while halal certification primarily serves Muslim consumers, sustainability and ethical practices resonate with many non-Muslim consumers, especially in Europe and North American market, where they are increasingly looking for responsible and value-driven product. So in this way, the halal products that integrate ESG principles can appeal to a much wider international markets. And of course, this goes without saying, the integration between ESG would strengthen a firm's long-term resilience. Okay, so when halal supply chain or companies move up the governance pyramid from compliance to convergence to transformative, halal is no longer viewed simply as a compliance requirement, but it becomes a strategic differentiator that support sustainable growth, that support responsible global trade. And with that in mind, the next question becomes rather practical. Okay, so I mean, it means like, how can firms actually move along the pathway? How firms could actually climb the pyramid? Okay, moving from compliance to its more advanced halal global supply chain. Well, to me, I think personally, the strengthening of the compliance system, the bottom part of the pyramid, remains the perpetual future agenda for halal supply chain management. Okay, because once the foundation is secure, firms can begin introducing measurable ESG indicators into the supply chain operation. And once they reach there, the next step is to improve or to include the digital technologies. So have transparency through digital technologies, tools like blockchain and IoT monitoring devices, maybe. Okay, and then at a more advanced stage, okay, perhaps maybe 10 to 15 years in the future, they may slowly begin aligning their halal supply chain practices with international sustainability frameworks and harmonize the standard. Okay. So these are the the governance pathway. And an important point to remember here is that this pathway is sequential. Okay, but I think it's flexible because different firms will move along the pathway and climb up the pyramid at a different speed, different pace, depending on their size, depending on the market exposure or the size of market that they are servicing, and of course their organizational capabilities. So, but the general direction is clear, okay, that halal supply chain can evolve from systems that primarily ensure basic compliance, religious and legitimacy compliance, into a system that also deliver sustainability, deliver accountability, and of course, credibility. Okay, so before I conclude, let's briefly summarize the main message of today's session. So, halal supply chain have traditionally been built on certification system. So certification remain extremely important because it provides the foundation of religious legitimacy, consumer trust. However, as the global halal economies continue to expand, new expectations are emerging. Consumers expect to focus on sustainability, ethical responsibility, and of course, transparency in governance. So the evolution we discussed today can be depicted in the three-level governance pyramid I shown earlier. So at the beginning, halal supply chain focused primarily on certification and compliance. Then the next stage involves integrating sustainability principles and ESG consideration into operation. And then finally, the most advanced stage, whereby halal supply chain have the potential to become a global benchmark for ethical and responsible trade. Yeah, so the message here is quite simple, quite straightforward. Halal integrity is the foundation and will remain so. But when halal principles are combined with sustainability and responsible governance, halal supply chain can play a much, much larger role in shaping a credible and ethical and overall a sustainable global market. Yeah, so I think that brings an end to my session this afternoon. So again, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that the session has provided you with a useful perspective on how halal supply chain can evolve beyond compliance, beyond legitimacy, and move more towards sustainable and ESG-driven practices. If you would like to continue the conversation or maybe collaborate on academic research or discuss industry initiatives related to halal logistics and sustainable supply chain, please, by all means, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to any questions or discussion that you may have. Oh, and also thank you to HSC Alliance team, and of course, Professor Mark Tiemann for arranging this masterclass initiative. So with that, thank you again for the time and attention. I pass the session back to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Syazwan, for this most interesting presentation on Beyond Halal Compliance, building sustainable and ESG-driven halal supply chains. Before we go to the Q&A, our next HSC Alliance Masterclass on the topic of halal marketing is on Thursday, 26 March. And we look forward to seeing you then.